Good morning, everybody. My presentation will be far less whizzing around than Veronica's. That was really impressive. We can tell you're also a digital expert there, Veronica. But what I've been asked to talk to you about is just to set a little bit of the framework for your thinking, the terms you're using, and the way you're using them. My name is Dr. Dan Moxon. I'm a researcher and a youth worker specialising in youth participation. I've worked a lot on the programmes, the various aspects of the programmes, developing things like the youth goals, the youth participation strategy, and basically just think about youth participation all day, I think. The proper title for this is meant to be youth participation projects, citizenship education, youth participation in democratic life. Are they all the same thing? That was far too long to fit on the slide, so I've just written something vague there instead. But that's what we're going to be thinking about a little bit in this presentation. And is actually what's the difference between some of these things, what's the overlap between some of these things, to give you a bit of a framework for communicating effectively, talking effectively, to think about the different topics you've got to think about and make sure you're all talking about the same things at the same times, really. So we'll look a bit about what do we mean by this term, young people's participation in democratic life or youth participation. How is that different from youth participation projects or initiatives or programmes? In the youth sector, we're sometimes not very good at making a distinction between those two things. And how is that different from citizenship education? There's lots of different words for citizenship education, things like civil education, civic education, but we use that as this is the term that's a bit more common in the formal education sector. Is the work that the two sectors do exactly the same thing? So let's start with the simple bit. This is the definition of youth participation in democratic life. It's in the youth participation strategy. And I'll read it out to you. We don't need to dive into all aspects in too much detail. But youth participation is about individual young people and groups of young people having the right, the means, the space, the opportunity and the support to express their views, contribute to and influence societal decision-making on matters affecting them, and be active within democratic and civil life of our communities. So the foundation for this, these things are basically drawn on human rights. And the foundation for this is a rights-based approach, and it's about what young people are able to do in society. These bits in purple here are about creating the environment for them to be able to do that, making sure people have the right to do things, the means to do things, the space, the opportunities. But what we're fundamentally interested in is the interaction between young people and democracy, or young people and the state even. And I'm not going to talk to you too much about the different ways young people do that, because I know we've got another speaker going on in those, but I think you can think of it broadly in two different ways. You can think about young people expressing their voice, so saying their views, saying their opinions, with the hope that someone in power makes a change in response to them. Some people call that political participation. I don't find that term particularly useful. But you can also think about young people taking actions. This is where they do something to make a positive change in society, to create the change that they want to see. So rather than going to someone else and saying, hey, politicians, we want you to do this, people take matters into their own hands and get involved in it. Some people refer to that as civic participation. I think the boundaries between these two things is very blurry when you look at it. But the key point of both of these things is it's about enabling it's about young people having influence. Whether they're expressing their voices or whether they're taking actions, it's about them having influence on democracy and influence on our societies. And all of that is bounded by a set of human rights that I won't go into which ones those are in detail, but you could call them in very broad terms the participation rights. And rights are things that need to be enacted. They need to be active, they need to be realised. They're not just things that are written on pieces of paper. You have the right when you're going out there and you're making use of it in a lot of ways. So when I'm talking about youth participation in democratic life, or young people's participation in democratic life, this is what we're referring to. And we're referring to it, you could think of it as a behaviour of young people or a relationship between young people and the state, or young people and democracy. But the point is that it's something that young people do. There are other things that other people can do to support that. So youth workers, teachers, governments, the media can all do things that support young people's participation. But it's not youth participation in democratic life unless it's about what young people are actively doing and saying and about them having influence, or at least attempting to have influence. And this is sort of takes me on to the first, and to move on from that in terms of the different ways that young people do this. I'm not going to dive into this too deeply because I think the next presentation will cover it. But you can think about the formal ways of youth participation, or the traditional ways, sorry, which is basically voting, membership of a political party, anything where you're engaging with those political structures. Researchers and policy tends to call that traditional modes of participation. And we know more or less that that's in decline compared to previous generations, and young people don't engage in those as much as, oh gosh, is that my phone going off? Sorry. Yeah, please turn it off. Young people don't engage as much in those forms of participation as older generations or older generations when they were younger. But the question then comes, are young people apathetic? Are they uninterested in having their voices? Are they uninterested in politics? And the answer is no. They're very actively engaged in other forms of participation, the so-called alternative forms, the new forms. These are things like protest movements, digital participation, collaborative projects, and I won't go in too much into what they mean because I know you've got a full presentation on that. But the short message is that young people are generally distrustful of formal politics, feeling like they're not represented in it, but still very interested in having their voices heard. So how do these things then relate to youth participation projects, that is the things that happen in the youth sector, and citizenship education? And don't get too hung up on the word projects, we could be talking about initiatives, programmes, any sorts of things there. And again, if you're in the formal education sector and you use terms like civil education, civic education, human rights education even, there's like 101 different terms with there for this in the formal education sector, and mostly the terms are used based on kind of which policies or which departments are kind of sponsoring or supporting the initiatives. There's not strong conceptual differences. And are these things, are they just the same thing but happening in different sectors? Let's kind of unpack that a little bit. This is what Veronica asked me to look at in this paper, and I think I'll be open from the start. I'm doing what a lot of researchers do and trying to make a theory or make a diagram out of quite a messy situation. The reality on the ground is often not perfect, but if you want a framework or a way of thinking about this, this is what I'm hoping to give you in this. So if you look first at youth participation projects and what do we mean by those, well, as I said, on a really simple level, you can think of this is just something that happens in the youth sector or within youth policy that tries to promote young people's involvement in democratic life. So it could be something like a voter registration campaign, it could be a consultation by a public body, a youth council or a political youth organisation, it could be a digital platform that tries to get young people's voices heard, a volunteering programme, could even be supporting a protest. And it can be something set up by young people, by civil society, or by a public body, or something collaborative between the two. But it's something in the youth sector that tries to promote young people's participation. Young people's participation in democratic life. And it generally has a couple of different approaches to do that. It does things like changing the conditions around young people. So we talked about the right, the means, the space and the support. So it's about putting in support, it's about making public bodies listen and engage with young people in different ways. It's about perhaps making it easier to register to vote. And sometimes it uses educational methods where it's about giving young people the skills and the competencies to engage in those sorts of things. But what people are interested in generally in the youth sector when they do youth participation projects is, do these projects lead to some sort of influence on decision making? So if you're running a project in the youth sector to support youth participation, typically you are thinking about doing things like, we brought a group of young people together, we supported them to think about what needs to be changed in their community, and then we went to a group of politicians or a group of decision makers and we said, hey, we'd like you to improve this or to improve that or to change this policy, or maybe we did a volunteering program where people went and tried to do those things themselves. And people in this sector, this is massive generalising, tend to measure the success of their projects or think about what the goals of their projects are is, did this project actually create the sort of influence? And we tend to say, were young people listened to? Did they get the changes they wanted to see coming out of this project? Invariably, that's quite a disappointing line of work to work in. It's very hard to make those sorts of changes. But that's generally the sorts of narrative we have in the youth sector, at least these days, about what youth participation projects do. So we're kind of measuring how well we're doing this, supporting young people's participation in democratic life by the amount of influence we're enabling or even empowering young people to have. And the key point is that we're directly trying to give these possibilities to young people to influence decision making by creating spaces for them to do that, encouraging more young people to directly engage in those things, and basically seeing, do people enact their right to participation? So how is that different to civic education? And again, we're making really big generalisations here, and I'd be really keen for anyone, particularly in the formal education sector, to come back to me and say, actually, I don't think that really fits, you're a bit off the mark there. But my take when you look at civic education is basically what it's thinking about most of the time is how do you educate young people? How do you enable young people to learn something? How do you enable them to develop the competencies that they need to engage in democratic life? Those of you who might be familiar with the Council of Europe framework, the reference framework of competencies for democratic culture, that's a very good touch point for what you're thinking young people need to learn to be able to do youth participation. But there's many, many more out there. I mean, the UN has produced hundreds, there are many at national level, but they broadly say the same sorts of things. They're about the values, the knowledges, the attitudes and the skills that young people need to engage in this. So in a way, it's a little bit narrower, because if we looked at the youth participation projects, we were talking there about, could we change the conditions around the young people? Maybe we could put new governance mechanisms in place, new consultation tools, new platforms, and occasionally a little bit about developing young people's skills and learning. But here we're much more strongly focused on what do young people learn as a result of citizenship education projects. But the difference between, say, citizenship education and maybe political science is you're not just teaching people about how democracy works and that's it. What you're hoping is that you're influencing them to engage within it more. So if you're running a political studies program, you kind of measure your success by, does that person pass the exam that shows they understand in all the different ways that government works? If you're running a citizenship education program, you're measuring your success by saying, did we influence those young people's behaviour? Were they more motivated and inspired and able to go forward and engage in young people's participation in democratic life? Now, I kind of was really open. I'm really massively generalising a bit here, and I can see a few faces going, oh, I don't think I agree with that. Because it is fair to say there is stuff that happens in the formal education sector which is also about changing the conditions around young people. There are things like schools, councils, participatory budgeting in schools, things where schools are much more proactive in terms of not just thinking what did young people learn, but what do we need to change around people. That really varies country by country. And in practice, all of those things still get called citizenship education by virtue of the fact they happen within formal schools environments. I would say that actually there's quite a bit of overlap between these two sorts of things. If you were looking at it, if you start to say this isn't just about what sector it's in, but it's about the concept of them, the boundary between stuff that focuses on changing the conditions and stuff that focuses on increasing young people's competencies is not always that distinct, and both of the sectors do tend to address both halves. And particularly if you're in one particular, maybe a local setting or a regional setting, the approaches to one or the other of these projects might be quite different. Certainly if you look back a bit more historically at youth participation, We were talking a lot more about motivating young people's active citizenship and these sorts of things, and that's almost not gone, but becoming a little bit more outdated within youth policy now, in that we still recognise that, but our emphasis is on that much broader changing the conditions and creating influence part. So, kind of as I said at the start, that idea you can put a really neat line between these two sorts of things, especially in different languages, different cultures, different terms, is these things are never perfect, but as a starting point to think about what's the difference between one thing and the other, then this is where I frame it for you. There's a couple of things we can think about with that definition in mind. This forum's about cross-sectoral cooperation. So, first of all, why should we collaborate in the first place? What is the value of the formal education sector collaborating with the youth sector, or vice versa? Well, what you can see straight away is there's quite similar goals there, although you could look at different pathways to get it. What you're trying to achieve at the end is something quite similar. And it's probably worth saying that young people's lives aren't bounded by sectors and policies, and you don't exist just thinking about youth policy and just thinking about education, formal education experiences. Anyone who's been anywhere near a youth participation project will know when you start to explore what young people want to see and change, you get all the issues under the sun straight away. So I don't think I've ever run a youth participation activity where young people haven't told me something about that they want to change within schools and educational settings, because it's such a huge part of people's lives. So actually, no matter which sector you're putting the mechanisms in to enable young people's participation, the things that young people are asking for could relate to any number of sectors, even people well beyond education as a whole. You could be talking about transport issues, healthcare issues. But you can see between these two sectors, there's a lot of synergy, there's a lot of opportunity. We're both trying to achieve very similar things. And so there's quite a strong opportunity for collaboration. And I think one of the interesting things to recognise is that democracy doesn't stop at the boundaries of your youth project or the boundaries of your school. Those two institutions or projects are situated within a democracy. They're influenced by the democracy that they're in, both positively and negatively. And so if you're really serious about working at a local, regional, or even national level to reinvigorate democracy and to create a healthy democratic culture, you have to be thinking about how all these different things fit together. One of the things I'm really interested in when we talk about participation at the moment is how you might hit critical mass. A lot of the time when we talk about our work, we often talk about small group work for sort of 10, 20, 30 people. I'm interested in us talking about how we do participation for a whole city or a whole region. And what would that need to look like? Does it mean the schools need to offer these kind of programs? The youth councils need to work like this? The public bodies need to operate in this way? How do all those parts fit together? And Veronica touched a little bit earlier on how the numbers weren't very good. They're definitely not very good. It's pretty clear our democracies don't work for young people very well at all, and we've got a lot of work to do to improve that. Those of us who are working with young people are only part of the solution to that, but actually thinking about how we all fit together as part of our societies and part of our communities is probably a very important part of that picture to get to the sort of critical change we want to see, where the vast majority of young people are now feeling that they trust in our democracies and now feeling that they know how to engage in them and that they want to engage in them, and not just through protest movements but through the formal channels as well. So kind of going back to this idea again, it's really important if we're trying to put this collaboration in place, particularly for those in the youth sector, to recognise that youth participation in democratic life is a term referring to the way young people behave and interact with democracy and their right to democracy. And that's slightly different from what you might call youth participation projects. We're actually a bit sloppy. We tend to just call everything youth participation, which is usually fine. I mean, it's a long term. But in terms of really being clear when we're communicating across the colleagues, we need to make that distinction between the work the youth sector does and the right and the behaviour of young people when they engage in democracy. And then we need to recognise a bit that citizenship education and youth participation projects, they're closely connected, but they've got quite different heritages and perhaps different but overlapping concepts within them in the way we've talked about there. And if it fits, recognising that citizenship education, again, it's primarily about this competency building, and youth participation projects is primarily about changing the conditions and creating influence. Both of those are good things and things that we need. And again, as we said, that's not necessarily always going to fit perfectly in every situation. There's some interesting things we can think about in terms of learning methods as well. So generally the evidence around what builds young people's competencies moves you towards non-formal methods of education, open classroom environments, setting up principles of debate and these kind of things. That can happen in both the youth sector and the non-formal sector, but there's a particular set of tools, often closely linked to experiential learning, which on the whole, research tends to indicate will be the most effective ways of doing this work. But we also need to think about reach and scale. Often in the youth sector, we like to say we're very good at being inclusive and we reach most young people. That's nonsense. The formal education sector reaches 98, 99% of young people in a population. So they're the ones that have the real outreach. And if we're thinking about how you make a critical change to participation in democracies as a whole, you need to think about that scale. But we do need to be really clear at a project level, and where I see really bad projects happen in either sector or within collaboration is when people aren't clear what's the goal of their project. Are they principally aiming about developing competencies amongst young people? Or are they principally aiming for young people to have an active political influence? Again, both of those things are good things, and usually at this stage someone comes back to me and says, yes, but it can be a bit of both. And yes, it can. But having evaluated quite a lot of youth participation projects, the bad ones tend to be when they aren't very sharp on this and they don't know which one is mostly important to them. Because an example of that would be, I worked with a youth council once and they'd had absolutely no political influence at all, made no changes, made no differences to young people. And the youth worker said, yes, but they've learned a huge amount. The youth councils have really developed. And I kind of went, yeah, that's great. You've been working with 15 young people for 3 years with one full-time member of staff. It really doesn't matter what they've learned because that was a waste of money. If you're really blunt about this, if one teacher could have educated 200, 300, 400 young people in that time. So whilst these things will always be at play, I like to push people and say, what's your primary goal here? Is it about political influence or is it about young people's learning? Because they tend to take you down very different styles of project. You might need to enable people to learn things to have influence, or you might learn things from having influence, but actually having really defined project objectives and knowing which you're going for, to me, is often the key to really impactful work. But I know not everyone would agree with that, and I'd be happy to challenge it. I think I've got about 2 minutes over my time, so I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you very much, everyone.
And we do have some 5 minutes for questions, remarks. All right. Great.
Hello, Dan. I remember you, I think from 2017 when Estonia was doing the presidency of, I remember you from that conference. Anyway, one of my main questions is that I'm kind of sort of looking at in two different directions as, for example, this influence without motivation, as in giving youth more influence without motivation. So I sort of see that the school role, because I'm a school principal nowadays, then I feel that the bigger question is to sort of see and even help students to find the self-motivators, to even find the influence. As in, I think the cross-sectoral work is even more necessary nowadays, that the school has to be a helper for the motivators, because I think, at least in Estonia, sometimes I feel that this certain passivity is also a sort of like a self-preservation method, because being unseen and also sort of it sort of keeps you more alive in front of all the mountain of expectations that the education level also gives you. So I think the school has to work with helping students find the motivators, and then the youth sector has to give the possibilities.
Yeah, completely agree. I think that's a really good way of framing the two roles. Motivation is a really interesting thing to talk about. I mentioned before, this is the Council of Europe's reference framework for competencies. So these are the things that they say people need to learn to be active in democracy. You've got values, attitudes, knowledge, and skills. Generally, what research tells us is that it isn't a lack of knowledge and skills that prevent most people from taking part in democracy. It's about the values and the attitudes, which is where motivation absolutely comes in. And what we see is that young people are generally very motivated to have their voices heard, but they don't feel that they're motivated to engage in formal political structures, so voting, getting engaged with parties, and they don't trust them a lot. Now, obviously, that's not the same for all young people. Like any kind of group of the population, you will have a group of people who are very, very disinterested, and I think we need to be open about the fact there are people who will have lots of other things going on in their lives at a certain time where expressing your political view is just not top of the list of priorities. I'm sure we've all had times like that. But actually, what I think we're very bad at doing in Europe is almost persuading people that democracy and our democratic institutions are great. And it's hard to talk about how we do that. Sometimes we use phrases like European values and that sort of thing. And a lot of our approach to education teaches people to be critical, which is a very important part of a democracy, but is also a bit demotivating to say, tell us everything that you think that's wrong with the state. We're pretty bad, and maybe I'm still feeling a bit sore from Brexit, we're pretty bad at saying, aren't European democracies wonderful? Haven't they brought us peace and stability and prosperity for years? Shouldn't we turn up to election to vote for people? And that's almost like, it's really weird to say that, isn't it? But we're kind of not good at getting a sense of kind of, maybe it's patriotism, maybe it's belief in the state. We're not good at persuading people that what we're doing as a group of countries is good and worthy of supporting, because we're often very saying, you need to critique and you need to challenge these things and look for all the negative things, which is a vital part of democracy, but doesn't transfer people to the ballot box. So I think that's one of the hardest challenges we've got ahead of us, and I think that's exactly where I would see schools fitting in. A lot of the projects that the youth sector does are often very for small numbers of young people, and we sometimes talk like we want every single young person to be in a youth council or a collaborative deliberation forum or something like that. We don't really expect that of adults. What we expect is maybe 10% of the population do that sort of thing, and 20% are a bit more engaged and do consultations regularly, and we'd like to see about 80% voting, and 10% we kind of accept have got other stuff going on. So it's like actually getting the large majority of the population knowing how they can express their voice and feeling that they would go and do it if they really wanted to is quite important. It isn't necessarily about having really extensive mechanisms for everyone. So yeah, really good point. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have space for one more question or remark.
Sorry, I gave a really long answer there.
Good answer.
So one question or remark. Anyone? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Magdalena and I come from Albania. I don't know if you have ever heard about it. So I'm a teacher in one of the, let's say, best high schools there. So I've been teaching their English for almost 20 years, and what I noticed while the professor was telling us or explaining what the democratic culture is, just a little background from my country. It is like we have been a communist country for 50 years, and it was like really hard back then. So after the regime, we had this transition part for kind of 30 years and still going on. And so we face this kind of challenge. What I see in my students is like there is, it's really important to teach them how to participate and how to collaborate with each other and how to think critically in order to find out a way how to deal with, let's say, or how to bring changes in our life. We need them. So our role as facilitators and educators and to teach really what the true values are, and not just to stay there and to please others or to behave as they expect us to. But if you see that something's wrong there, just stand up for your right and tell the other person that this is wrong. I can't do any more like that. So I find this really, really, really interesting, and I guess that it's crucial that in our schools it is implemented something in order to change the whole situation that we are in. I'm so sorry to say that actually very, very few students in our school do stand up and do participate in such initiatives. So I think that it would be great to just transmit all this kind of experience that we're getting here or there. It would be fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I think there's something really important to talk about that's around countries that are newer democracies, let's say post-Soviet countries particularly, and ones with stronger connections to communist times, is that you have to see it in two strands. There's a strand of getting citizens, not just young people, to have exactly what you just talked about, but there's also a strand of work that's not for the youth sector or the education sector to do, but definitely still needs doing, which is about getting the public bodies, the public institutions, the democratic institutions to be open to critique and to be open to criticism, and because it's still people with long personal heritages of the Soviet times, where that wasn't, as I understand, it wasn't necessarily the culture in government there. So to actually, it's quite scary for them to be in environments where you've got open, critical, challenging citizens, but that's actually part of what a healthy democracy looks like. So you have a real challenge in that, on the one hand, you're saying to young people, hey, we can be open, we can be critical, and that's an important part of your right. And probably public bodies who are just getting used to that, maybe not quite as ready for it, it's a bit more challenging. Certainly not to say that all established democracies and Western democracies do that very well, but there's probably a longer standing, something quite cultural about that way governance works and the way it operates, yeah.